Let's go. Greg's got the news, Danny's got the flair. One talks the cloud, the other's out there. Servers spinning, bites keep grinning. Tech talk laughs, let's get the show winning. Cyberwise guys, we're cracking the code. Tech and juggles on overload. Urge your dreams, cybersecurity schemes. It's the podcast you need, like coffee and memes.
Welcome to CyberWise Guys, where we break down the latest trends, threats, and technologies in cybersecurity, helping you stay one step ahead and cyber-wise. Our guest today is Sounil Yu, a widely respected cybersecurity thought leader and the creator of Cyber Defense Matrix, a practical framework used globally to align security strategy and outcomes. With experience across government, enterprises, and startups, he is known for simplifying complex security challenges and helping organizations focus on what truly reduces risk. Currently, Sunil serves as the Chief AI Officer at Gnostic. Welcome to the show, Sunil. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. It's great to finally make this happen in the new year.
Yeah. You've noticed that in the intro, I did not use the word expert because I know you're trying actively to refrain from presenting yourself as such. But for those of you who are not familiar with you, would you mind maybe taking a minute or two and kind of introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been in cybersecurity and IT for, I feel really old, way past a little like 35 years almost or more.
Wow.
And I'm not that old. It's because I've been tinkering with technology and actually have had jobs in IT and security for a very long time, even as a small kid. So, but anyway, I've been able to turn that into a consulting practice when I was at Booz Allen. I then went to Bank of America, where I was their chief scientist for several years. And this is actually where I came up with the cyber defense matrix, because the challenge that I had at the time was, well, Bank of America, we have a fairly large security budget, and naturally, when you naturally have a lot of vendors who come and try to sell you stuff. And so I had a really difficult challenge trying to figure out what people are selling me, to how to make sense of all the noise that we see. So anyway, or hear, I should say. So anyway, that was the genesis of the cyber defense matrix at Bank of America. After I left Bank of America, I tried to spend some time writing a book on the topic. Felt like I needed more practical guidance that I could put into the book. So after that, I went to venture capital, where I spent time talking to entrepreneurs and VCs and startups to see if this works in that sort of ecosystem. But also, I had a great chance to talk to a whole bunch of other practitioners and see whether or not the ideas that I had in the cyber defense matrix actually works beyond Bank of America. To my surprise, I thought it would work well for large enterprises because that's Bank of America, right? But I was actually surprised by how well it worked for a lot of other smaller organizations, and MSPs in particular. They were actually one of the most avid adopters of this matrix because I think it made a lot of sense. So anyway, that's kind of been my journey. Since Bank of America and VC days, I've then jumped into a startup where I was their CISO for a couple of years. And now, as Danny mentioned, I've started my own startup called Gnostic, where I'm CTO, but I prefer to call myself a chief AI officer because that's really I'm trying to govern the proper use of AI. And it's a whole new brand new field that demands deeper thinking than what we're putting to it today.
Can you tell us a little bit about Gnostic maybe, and your role there as Chief AI?
Yeah, so real quickly, and this isn't about Gnostic as much as about Cyber Defense Matrix and other things, but it was really a genesis of a thought problem, a thought exercise that I had, which is, what is the new type of problems that we're going to see in cybersecurity as it relates to AI? And ultimately, I had another mental model, called the DIKW pyramid. It stands for data, information, knowledge, wisdom. I shouldn't claim that this is my model. It's an existing model, but my application of that model towards cybersecurity and AI was pretty novel. Ultimately, it pointed out that we have a knowledge problem that has emerged. It's no longer a data problem and an information problem. It's a knowledge problem. And that demands a whole new set of controls and ways of thinking. And so Gnostic, which in Greek means knowable, agnostic, if you know that, of course, everyone knows that term, means it's like not knowable. agnostic means it's knowable. And so that was kind of the play on words there. We've since then expanded to also provide controls for coding agents. And that's been primarily where we've gotten a lot of traction because we're seeing a lot of enterprises adopt coding agents, and they don't necessarily, they're not well suited for these environments that we have developers in. When you introduce a AI agent into it, it just changes the dynamic of how everything works because these IDEs and the developer environments were never designed with AI agents in mind.
First time I think I saw you, Sunil, was at a TD Cinex event. You stood on the
Mhm.
stage with one of our
Sean.
VPs, with Sean, and you presented the matrix. And I think Sean back in the day came from this, okay, this is the matrix or the framework we want to look at from a security standpoint. And he really developed, he took your model and basically tailored the TD Cinex security practice on it. But so from a distribution perspective, it really helps not just partners but our own internal employees to understand where are the strengths and I would say opportunities that we see, right, as a security provider, as a distributor or second tier security provider. But when you developed it, I guess you had other things in mind, and you've mentioned MSPs. So can you tell us a little bit what led you to put those controls in place?
Yeah. So actually, first of all, for those listeners who aren't familiar with the cyber defense matrix, let me just quickly describe it. And it should hopefully be easy to understand. And that's the hope. I mean, this has been why it's been embraced so widely. So imagine a bingo card, a 5x5 bingo card. And so on one dimension, you have the 5 functions of the NIST cybersecurity framework: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. On the other dimension are 5 asset classes that we tend to try to secure or that we have controls for. So devices, applications, networks, data, and users. What we also have on the bottom of the matrix is this changing degree of dependency between people, process, and technology, where we have a higher degree of dependency on technology on the left, on the functions of identify and protect, and a higher degree of dependency of people as we move towards detect, respond, and recover. And throughout the entire, all 5 functions, we have an equal amount of dependency on process. And so the, this sort of model provides a nice, simple, hopefully easily memorable
Yeah.
framework
Well,
that people can say,
yeah. So I'm just sharing it with our listeners and audience, so they can kind of like grasp what you're describing.
yeah. And as I mentioned, it's meant to be it's something that one can hold in their mind relatively easily. And I think that's been one of the reasons why it's been successful because people can generally, it's not a difficult model to grasp, if you will. And what I've done in my own experiences, when I talk to a vendor, I mentally put them in one of these boxes just so that I can anchor my recollection of the conversation based on a visual representation that's in my head. So, I talk to tons of vendors, but you don't always remember what they do. Moreover, they claim to do everything in all these boxes. So that makes it really challenging to understand what problem they're trying to solve. And that was fundamentally what I was trying to do when I was at Bank of America. I would spend time talking to these vendors. I would quickly forget what they do until I started putting them into their appropriate boxes. I think the reason why it's also been helpful for MSPs is because they're trying to tell a similar story to their customers. And their customers, of course, have no idea or have very little understanding of cybersecurity as a whole. And what they've done with this matrix is use it as a way to communicate very quickly to their stakeholders. Hey, here's what you have today. And there's a multi-layered view of the matrix. You can layer on technologies, of course, and what you're selling or what you're distributing. But you can also layer on things like, here are controls that we need to consider. Or if I have a threat like ransomware, what boxes are most affected? And therefore, I may want controls in those particular boxes. And so if I overlay then my existing stack on top of that and realize, oh, I have a gap here, it makes a pretty compelling argument to say, well, we need to bolster our controls in these particular boxes because this new emerging threat that we call whatever is specifically affecting weaknesses in that particular area. And so MSPs just use that to communicate to their stakeholders and make it very clear. This is why, here's the bigger picture of what we're trying to do. What's really important is there are, I want to make anyone believe that you have to cover all those boxes. That's oftentimes a misconception. I have 25 boxes in this bingo card. Surely I have to check every box. But that's like playing blackout. And you will bankrupt yourself if you try to do that. We're trying to play bingo and win bingo. And what is the minimum essential set of things that we need to do to be able to win bingo? And it's not covering every box. It's covering what you need to be able to cover your most important threats, your most against your most have protections on your most critical assets against the most urgent threats. And that doesn't actually look like a matrix that's filled to the brim. It looks like a matrix that is selectively chosen, where we say, here's where we're getting the most bang for our buck.
I think that's interesting that this matrix, when you first look at it, you're like, well, just looking at all of these different aspects of cybersecurity, and you think it would be something that would just allow you to just add on these different sources, right? These different services.
Mhm.
But if you look closely at it and consider what it's asking and what it's looking at, you're actually reducing the number of solutions that you would need, right? So there is a reduction in the amount, because I know a lot of businesses will use. I read some study that said it could be up to 80 different security solutions, right?
That's
So
right.
this can actually help you reduce the number. Can you talk a little bit about that, reducing the number of services based on your matrix?
Yeah. So actually, one way to think about it is if I looked at it purely from a compliance angle, then I do actually have to check these boxes. But if I'm really looking at it from a governance and risk angle, then you have to make deliberate trade offs. You have to say, if I'm going to put money into this box, or rather, I know I can't spend infinite, nobody can spend infinitely. So now I have essentially um, space upon which I know I can operate. And if I only have, let's say, 10 pieces to put in those boxes, well, which boxes am I going to cover? And there's a very deliberate, explicit sort of declaration that I believe, given the information I have today, here are the areas that I think require coverage. And sometimes that may require moving a chip, so to speak, off of one box and moving it to another box, knowing that you've exposed something in this particular box that was previously maybe covered. And that is intensely uncomfortable for many of us in security who feel like, well, we got to have full coverage everywhere. But that's a very compliance-oriented view. And if you consider the G and the R part of GRC, is the way that we think about governing our organization, the way we think about making risk management decisions. And those risk management decisions are based on a calculated belief that we should spend more money here at the expense of something else. And so fundamentally, that drives towards a conversation of, well, what can we actually get rid of? Because we think that getting rid of this frees up time and attention and resources towards actually addressing a potentially a more problematic area that could harm us more because it involves assets that we care even more about.
How do you think the risk? So it seems like all of this is based on responding to assessed risk. How with this matrix, how does a proper risk assessment fall into that?
Yeah. So the way I would describe it is that I talked about different layers, and one of the analogies I use is a food analogy. So think about when you make a decision to, let's say, for family Thanksgiving dinner, and you have a couple things that you have to account for. You have to account for that you have a recipe for different things you want to make. You have allergies or constraints that you have to account for. You want to meet a certain set of nutritional needs. I mean, sure, it'd be great if you served potato chips and fries and so on and so forth, but you're not going to meet the appropriate nutritional needs. Think of those as threats. Okay. And then you have a whole bunch of ingredients and things that you have in your pantry and so on and so forth. Well, the combination of all these different perspectives guides what you make. Okay. And in the same way, in cybersecurity, using the analogy for cybersecurity, I have allergies in the form of business constraints. I would love to, for example, remove admin rights from all developers. Okay. But if I try to do that, no developer can really get their work done anymore. So that's an actual constraint, an allergy, if you will, that they have. And even if I want to put a control there, I may get fierce resistance from even if there's some compliance or some regulation or some whatever that says you must do this, I know that it is so detrimental to the business that I'm going to potentially ignore or make a risk management decision to say, I'm going to be out of compliance with that particular thing because it has worse outcomes for the business as a whole. So that's when we talk about risk versus compliance, that's really the kind of distinction. I am deliberately choosing to be out of compliance or to ignore certain compliance requirements because it is harmful to the business, or I don't think it's as big of a deal as the compliance requirement stipulates. And by the way, we've done this to some degree. For example, changing passwords. If you look at for a long while, we used to have a requirement that says you have to change your passwords every 30 days or 90 days, whatever. Most of us, by mid 2010s, realized that just doesn't make any sense anymore, and so we chose to be out of compliance, knowing that the risks were pretty low, or there were different mechanisms for password management. Once we recognized that the computing power to figure out passwords were greatly exceeded any complexity requirements we could put in.
So are there certain categories in the model that you feel organization investing more in or should invest more in?
Yeah. So, okay, the answer to that question is really dependent upon in the 5 asset classes: devices, apps, networks, data, users. What I have found is that different organizations, different types of organizations have different priorities based on the nature of their business itself. So, for example, if you're a software company or SaaS company, you will tend to prioritize your application based controls and your data centric controls and put a lot of energy into controls there. If you're a manufacturing organization, you may put more into device security and network security. And so there's an interesting sort of shift. The shift happens because of the industry that you're in and what assets that you have that support your business for which they have more or less exposure. So the answer in terms of the asset classes is it depends on the industry that you're in. With respect to the different functions, we almost always start with this desire for visibility. We want visibility into whatever. And there's 2 ways to interpret the word visibility. One is under the function of identify, and that is just like an inventorying function. Just tell me that it exists. Okay, tell me that people are using this resource. Tell me that people are using this AI system or this SaaS application, or that someone bought a new computer and stuck it on the network. That's an identify function, and that kind of visibility is one type of visibility that when you use the word visibility, we tend to reference that type of need. The other type of visibility that oftentimes people ask for actually manifests as a detect visibility, in the sense of something has happened. I just want to know that it happened. Eventually, we move to, okay, I want to stop it from happening. And that then becomes a protect function. So it's kind of almost the protect and the detect parts are oftentimes backwards. But we tend to ask for detect capabilities before we ask for protect capabilities, because when we say we want visibility, it's first and foremost the function of identify, then the function of detect. And then once we have a clear understanding of what we're dealing with, then we move to try to protect.
Gotcha. So tell me a little bit how the partners have been rolling this out strategically to their customers. Your matrix. How have you seen different variations of this? What does that look like when they're in front of their customers?
Well, so I'm not privy to those conversations as much, but I've seen some artifacts, and those artifacts include I've seen I mentioned earlier, a depiction of here are your existing controls, here are the services that we're delivering to you today, and then there's a upsell opportunity that they are trying to make, and in the upsell opportunity, they highlight different areas of need, but those needs are again anchored on, using the food analogy, nutritional needs, using a cyber analogy. Hey, ransomware. You care about ransomware? I'm sure you've heard about it, or you've heard about the different types of phishing attacks or BEC or whatever else it is. If these are the kind of concerns that you feel like you're that warrant additional attention and controls, then here are the different upsell. Here are the additional controls that we can bring to the table on your behalf.
And this is a natural connection to services too.
This is actually particularly important to then point out the bottom part of that pyramid, the cyber defense matrix. There's this degree of dependence between people, process, and technology, but that degree of dependency is not equal for each of those different functions. What I put forth as a hypothesis, and when I first created the matrix, and I would still say it's a hypothesis. I've collected a lot of data to suggest that it's pretty correct. But anyway, that's it. The general thesis I had was it seems like there are more people oriented needs as you start moving towards detect, respond, and recover. And when we talk about people oriented needs, oftentimes that translates into services. There is still a little bit of people needs in the functions of identify and protect, but usually you're buying more technology. And as you move towards detect, respond, and recover, you're really buying more services. And I think that pattern has held pretty well. And for MSPs that are primarily functioning in the identify and protect side of the equation, really what they're doing is just bring a whole bunch of technologies and they hire, you don't need that skill. Well, yeah, hopefully this is not offending anybody, but the level of skill you need to perform the functions of identify and protect it doesn't have to be that specialized. But as you move towards detect, respond, and recover, you actually need people who deeply understand the technology, understand hunting, understand how to pick adversaries out, understand what the telemetry means from a detection, like is an adversary actually in my environment? So that skill set is really hard to find. And so we oftentimes turn to other organizations that can provide those people, and that again turns into services.
So moving from MSPs to more MSSPs and adding
That's right.
adding the security layers that many smaller organizations or smaller partners cannot provide. You've mentioned that when you initially had the idea for the matrix, right? You were working for a larger organization. How the smaller organization with limited budgets can prioritize their spending using the
Yeah, so Greg hit upon this earlier. I talked about it in terms of how you get rid of technologies, but if you look at what Greg was also hinting at earlier in terms of this constrains what you have to focus on and what technologies you need to buy, you don't have to buy 80 technologies. Maybe you only need to buy, 10 key ones that cover the areas that you care about the most. And I would say that's the approach I would take for smaller organizations. I was going to say, don't just blindly go with the compliance frameworks because they will make you feel like you have to do everything. It is, if you start with the C part of GRC, that's what you'll end up with. But if you start with the G part of GRC, then you'll end up with a much more clearer view of here's what here's what really matters to me in the business. And here are the controls that I need. And the compliance frameworks becomes more of a menu list of things that I can consider, but I don't necessarily have to always order. So if I'm ordering food, the compliance menu is vast and long, but you'll again bankrupt yourself if you try to order everything off of that menu. What you're trying to do is really say, I have a certain set of nutritional needs, I have a certain set of allergies. Let me be very selective in what I need given the budget that I have. And by the way, sometimes I may need to have some people consume things that will cause an allergic reaction. But that's also part of the governance and risk side of the equation. We're not infinitely willing to take all types of risks. We are going to have to tell the business at some point that in some cases, like, hey, no, sorry, you really can't do that. We really don't want you to send all our intellectual property up into ChatGPT for it to process and produce a strategic report, whatever.
Okay, I'll stop doing that.
Yeah, Danny. This is being live streamed on some site somewhere now. Thanks.
That's right. Yeah. So again, but again, some people are going to have an allergic reaction to that and say, well, I can't get my job done. Well, let's find a different way to get that job done, but it may not be as convenient and whatever. You get the idea. But it's a conversation. It's a reason for having a conversation. And actually, maybe that's another major part of the matrix. The matrix is just a means to communicate. It facilitates communication. It facilitates common understanding. And that's actually been perhaps the reason why it's been most really popular. But it's also been why I think, well, like one of the most common questions I get about the matrix is there some tool that I can use to make the matrix easier to maintain inside my environment? And I've seen a number of vendors that I've worked with, or startups that I've worked with, that have tried to turn the cyber defense matrix into a tool. And I'm happy with whatever progress they can make there. But at the end of the day, in its most simplest format, which is a PowerPoint or some, a two-dimensional sheet where people can just mark it up and have a conversation over it, that's been where it's been most useful.
But how would CISOs do when trying to communicate adoption of this framework to the board? So when I ask that question, even now, I'm thinking, well, just talk in terms of money, but that's incomplete. How do you advise citizens who want to adopt this in their organization to speak to the boards or their executive leadership on adopting the matrix?
Sure. Yeah. So to explain that, let me walk through a couple other analogies first. Um, we have different sort of mental models or maps, if you will, when we think about the world. You have the atlas. Oh, we have a globe. Okay. Then you have atlases. You have country maps, city maps, street maps, building maps. Okay. The cyber defense matrix is more like a country map, maybe even an atlas. And the perspective here is I can communicate certain things at that level. But if the board is operating at the globe level, there's a disconnect. There's going to be a somewhat of a disconnect, a translation that needs to happen. Likewise, if I'm at the atlas or country level and I'm talking to somebody at the building level, they're going to be like completely lost as far as what I'm trying to communicate. We have a similar using the maps analogy across all these maps. We have a common word, which is the word directions. Give me directions. But at the atlas level, the words that we use for directions are north, south, east, west. At the building level, it's left, right, straight. In cybersecurity, across all these different maps, if you will, frameworks and whatnot, we also have we have a similar word, and that word is called risk. Okay. But the words I use at the globe level might be dollars, but the words I use at the building level might be operational downtime. Okay. Which may translate into dollars, but most people don't have a visceral reaction to. If this goes down, you're going to be out of. The system is going to be down for up to 72 hours. And by the way, this might happen during Christmas or New Year's, and you're going to be working inside some stupid data center and not enjoying time with your family. And people will have a visceral reaction to that. I could say that costs $100,000, but that doesn't trigger any sort of reaction for people at certain levels. Whereas it might trigger it for others. Okay, so all that is to say, the cyber defense matrix at the board level is, I would say, one step removed from that type of conversation. Can you take if a board member is willing to double click one level lower, then it's wonderful because it provides a lot of background detail. But in most cases, when I've seen the cyber defense matrix presented at the board level, it is oftentimes it just colors. It says, hey, at a really high level, here's what we have coverage over, here's where we don't have coverage, here's what we're working towards that. Any questions? Thank you very much. Get out.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
Makes sense.
So,
excellent.
Yeah, you've mentioned a few things earlier, and I want to maybe take the conversation into the future, if you will, because we spoke about the beginning in the past, and we spoke about what's going on now. But AI has been a major pain in many people. But where would AI, and you mentioned agents earlier, where would they fit inside the cyber defense matrix today, and where do you see it fitting in moving into the future, even though it's probably very difficult to predict what's going to happen? Though when I think of it, I think I heard you say in the past that any good model should have some sort of predictive function in it. Do you feel like the Matrix was able to kind of, I don't want to say predict AI, because I think AI was predicted by Asimov many years ago, but do you think there was an aspect of prediction built into the Matrix, and how do you see it fit now?
Yeah. So let me actually first describe a real quick difference between a model and let's say just a list. If I had a list and I just said, go list, 5 things that you think are problematic with AI, you'll come up with a list. And then I would say, well, what about number 6, number 7, number 10, whatever. Meaning that there's not really a clear bounds for what makes this list. But I've seen a lot of people take a list and say that's a model or a framework. I'm not sure if that's a really good one, because it's hard to understand the bounds of what this is. The bounds creates these constraints, but these bounds also make it very clear what the full scope of something might be. So the cyber defense matrix was actually pretty useful in predicting this evolution of security as we go through these different eras of identify, protect, detect, respond. And now we're in the era of recover, or the era of resiliency. And I have a whole talk on that called the DIE triad. So the letter DIE triad, if you want to look that up, you'll see how I made my prediction around why the 2020s is the age of recover or resiliency, and why we need to really think about what that looks like from a cybersecurity standpoint. So anyway, the model, the cyber defense matrix actually gave me a clear view of that. And I made that prediction actually almost 9 years ago now, saying the 2020s would be the age of resiliency. And guess what? We are in the age of resiliency today. So it was a predictive model in that regard. However, there's another wonderful quote. There's a wonderful quote by this guy, George Box. And his quote is, "All models are wrong." So this model isn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, similar to like the Atlas. The Atlas is a model of the world, but it's not a perfect model. It doesn't answer every question that you can imagine. And if you try to answer every question in an Atlas level, it becomes indecipherable because it's just inundated with too much content that you can't figure out. So it doesn't serve as a useful, it no longer, even if it may be accurate, it no longer serves as utility because it becomes too congested with too many things. And that has been a danger of the cyber defense matrix. People trying to put too many things into the matrix, and if the matrix itself becomes indecipherable, you can no longer make decisions based on it because it seems like every box is filled with something. Okay. Okay. So if the cyber defense, so the question fundamentally was, where does AI fit into the cyber defense matrix? And trust me, I tried to answer that question a long time ago, and I realized, okay, this may be the wrong model. So that I tried to figure out then, how do I make this? Is there a way I can still see or understand different aspects of AI using the cyber defense matrix? And at the risk of confusing your audience, let me walk through a journey real quickly. Let me give you a real quick journey of part of that discovery. So the cyber defense matrix in its key form and its main form is it's this two-dimensional model. Okay, now imagine for a moment, let's make it three-dimensional. That third dimension manifests when you look at each of the asset classes and say, well, is there something deeper that describes, let's say, devices or applications or networks or whatever else it may be? And for networks, there is. It's called the OSI model. And if you consider the OSI model with all the 7 layers, well, it turns out we actually need identify, protect, detect, respond, recover for some of those layers, layer 3, layer 4, layer 7 in particular. Okay. And they're like, oh, okay, well, so that it works. It doesn't work for it. We don't need it for every layer, but there's definitely a distinctiveness in the type of controls you have for a layer 3 and layer 4 type of need versus a layer 7. And so I said, okay, if there exists that type of dimensionality to networks, do we have similar dimensionality for other asset classes? And specifically for AI, I started to look into the data dimension and said, is there something more deeper in data? And the answer was yes, there is. And I hinted at it earlier, which is there's another mental model called the DIKW pyramid, data, information, knowledge, wisdom. And so data has its own sort of OSI model. And once we recognize that exists, then what I went through and did was, okay, now we know we have data controls. And we have this thing called information. What exactly is that? Well, like data controls could be, do you have permission for something to this file, to this folder? The information controls would be, well, what's the sensitivity label that we put on that folder or that file? Then the knowledge level is, well, what's the content about? And do you have a need to know for the nature of that content? And what I realized was, okay, that is really at that knowledge level capability is right square where AI. And I'll give you an example of how that's manifesting today in the public sphere. Should OpenAI or should ChatGPT tell you about suicide? Well, it depends, right? Right now, societally, we're saying if you're a teenager or under 18, the answer is no. But if you're a counselor or if you're an adult, sure. Maybe. Anyway, but you get the idea. There's this sort of decision that we're trying to make that says, what should people know and what should these AI systems divulge? And that really depends upon your need to know and who you are and your job function and whatever it was. There may be some things that are universal. Like we don't need anybody, well, we would say don't let anyone know about how to build biological weapons. But if I'm a researcher in Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is near me, they are doing bio research. They
Right.
absolutely have a need to know for this, right? And so this sort of, and by the way, no data level control is going to fix this. No sensitivity level control is going to fix this. It requires a whole new type of thinking because it's a new level of abstraction. And so that's an example to Danny's question, a long way to answer the question of like, where does AI fit into the cyber defense matrix? Well, I could have easily said, well, it fits into the data row of the cyber defense matrix. But that's but then you realize, wait, this doesn't fit as well as we like. It doesn't give me additional insights about the nature of the problem and the controls. And so this is where I have to double click and say, let's look a little bit deeper and see where it fits in. And to just throw another wrench into the mix, the cyber defense matrix may be entirely the wrong model for other aspects of AI. But if we can find the right mental model, it reveals tons of new things about the problem space of AI. And I've done that with other mental models, like, for example, the OODA loop, where I've used that to understand agentic AI. And it's been a wonderful journey because you start discovering new things. And to Danny's point just at the beginning earlier, it has amazing predictive power. I can tell you, using this mental model of the OODA loop, I've seen exactly what the trend is, and where like 2026, in my view, what my analysis of the mental model for the OODA loop suggests is the 2026 is going to be all about agentic orchestration as like the hot topic. And potentially needing controls there. And I can give you a very clear step-by-step progression as to why that's going to be the case.
So I actually wanted to ask you about other models and frameworks you might be working on or working with. But between all of those that you've mentioned so far, I think we're going to invite you for another episode, just to kind of like go through those, if you'd be open to that, right? I don't know.
Happy to do so.
Okay, perfect. So, and I think we've brushed about this a little bit earlier in the conversation, but what adjustments would you suggest organization that implemented the matrix in the security program, right, would make now that AI is gathering faster and bigger momentum every day?
Okay, so there are two things that I've tried to map into the matrix. You just talked about AI and how AI was difficult to map in. The other one that's been somewhat challenging is cloud and the infrastructure as service, cloud computing, all that kind of stuff. And there's a part of which I can map cloud into the cyber defense matrix and say, okay, here are different controls that fit in different places. But there's a part of it that was the other part of it that was really hard to do and to express in this matrix is the fact that cloud introduced a whole new operating model. And the operating model, I can put into the process side of it and say, look, how we think about process had to fundamentally change with cloud. Representing process in this 5x5 matrix, I haven't cracked a nut on that. I haven't cracked a nut in a way that is simple to visually show. I have a very convoluted wire diagram that nobody can really understand. But the fundamental point here is that there were some real process changes that we really needed to introduce because cloud was a whole new operating model. Nonetheless, what I tried to do in the cyber defense matrix was to make process a very prominent part of the matrix itself. In other words, do not forget that process, like new processes and adjustment of processes, is a fundamental part of cybersecurity, just as much as buying a technology or just as much as hiring people. In fact, it is the most underinvested aspect of cybersecurity, in my view. Okay. And this is especially the case when it comes to AI as well. AI is not just automation. AI is not just a chatbot. AI is a fundamentally new way of doing things. And it's going to fundamentally change how we should think about our business processes. And if we forget that we're not investing in process, then we are going to shortchange ourselves as it pertains to not just leveraging the technology, but also in securing that technology as well.
If you could leave our viewers with one thing, one or two bits of advice or information, what would you say?
Well, I hate to re-say some of the things I've just said, but I think what I left off with that AI is a whole new operating model is probably the one major takeaway I would make sure that folks recognize. And what is that operating model is something that I'm putting a lot of time and energy into thinking through And the mental models are actually perhaps the best way to do that. So the last takeaway I would offer is do not underestimate the power of mental models. The cyber defense matrix is actually the combination of 3 mental models: the people, process, and technology side of it, the NIST cybersecurity framework, and then the 5 asset classes. Each mental model gives us a clearer view of the world. When you start merging them together, it sharpens that view in ways that reveal things that I'm still discovering, but it provides these deep insights that are oftentimes lost when you just look at these models in isolation. So my biggest takeaway, and then I would be more than happy to come back for a subsequent session on just mental models alone, but don't underestimate the power of mental models. They are a clearer way to take all the information that we're seeing come from LinkedIn and AI slop and just random conversations. Serves as a wonderful filter so that you can really discern, have wisdom and discernment in the things that we're hearing and seeing from everywhere.
Well, thank you, Sunil. Thank you, Greg, as always.
Yes.
And I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in to Cyber Wise Guys. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Until next
Yes.
time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay cyber wise. Thank you.
Let's go. Greg's got the news.